Really excited for this session. So I'm going to be the moderator for a panel discussion. A panel discussion around emerging technology adoption challenges at financial institutions. So if you remember when I introduced myself, the best part of my job is getting to talk with industry leaders and really leaders in technology. And today we have Isaac de Souza, who's responsible for artificial intelligence and emerging technology risk at BMO. And Elizabeth Hunker, a Senior Director of Innovation at Northwestern Mutual. Now, they have a breadth of experience actually outside of their current roles, so I'm really excited to have this conversation today. One note, we're going to keep it interactive. So it's a panel up here, but we're going to be watching for questions. So we would encourage you to actually participate in the conversation today. So if you have any questions on some of the topics we'll be talking about, put your hand up and we'll address them with you. Okay, so Elizabeth and Isaac, if we could just start with a quick introduction of your background.
Sure. Hello, everybody. So I, as mentioned, am Senior Director of Innovation at Northwestern Mutual, and I could talk a little bit about, I was just speaking with Isaac about our unique position there is sort of to bring the things that the rest of the organization cannot risk to bring on. And so this is all about kind of assessing risk and then isolating it on our kind of renegade team. Previously, kind of my background is startups, predominantly in the Web3 space, ever since about college, kind of getting into the earliest waves of that and then seeing many ups and big downs through that space. But, if you zoom out, up on the general. I'm very passionate about decentralization of agency for all stakeholders in kind of any program, UX, organization, and that's sort of where we're looking at focusing how we can get the best of both worlds on adopting kind of the benefits of insights from aggregated data while being able to also have kind of have our cake of keeping it decentralized and secure and giving agency to everyone involved. And that's where my innovation focus has been through startups and then bringing it to the kind of Fortune 90 space.
Thank you. Isaac, please.
So I am the AI and Emerging Tech Risk Officer at BMO. So I help kind of provide some of the oversight towards adopting some of these technologies and how we might look at it and what are some of the incremental risks that we might have to address. My background is actually not very much so in finance. So prior to BMO, my background is kind of more in the space industry, startup world. So I spent a lot of time, working on like Mars rover prototypes, satellite systems, lasers, that kind of stuff, planetary science. For a long time, emerging technology was just really a part of my life. I've always had a really strong passion for this kind of development. I've always wanted to know about the latest, the best new things, see what's happening in someone's basement and where that might go. And it kind of, over the last 10 years, that was the space that I kind of operated in. So, I think what has happened is as these technologies start going more mainstream, we're seeing things like what we have with Northwestern and BMO, or even all the other banks, we're seeing a lot of interest to try to adopt some of these technologies and try to extract the value from it, because there's a bit of a fine balance between adopting too early or too late. There is an advantage that you can get, and you got to get it just right, but there's risks as well. And so I try to help, bring some of that experience that I've had into the financial institution to help kind of guide those conversations, and try to determine, when is the right time to do something, and if so, what's the best way to do it.
Awesome. So I think, again, the exciting part of this discussion is the diverse backgrounds. So the idea that we're talking venture capitalism, space, banks, insurance companies. So I maybe we could start with maybe a high-level commentary on what you're seeing industry-wide, I suppose, at large companies, and the types of lessons that you think that you can bring from your experience in that startup or the emerging technology space to help to accelerate and reduce the risk of adopting these emerging technologies and specific AI. So why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I actually spent the last few years spending a good portion of my time surveying C-suite technologists at Global 2000 companies about what technologies they were adopting, what was driving those decisions, which they weren't, which were they getting rid of, and what was driving those decisions as well. And yeah, as far back as at least 2017, we started to see the oscillating trend between AI is the new hot thing and Web3 is the new hot thing, as we're calling it now. Basically, every year they kind of have been trading off a bit, as you might have seen some memes indicating that trend. But yeah, the adoption at AI for AI really upticked significantly around 2015, 2016 across kind of the larger institutions, and it kind of left the Silicon Valley kind of venture capital kind of interest space as it became, especially up through now, really much less of a nice to have and much more of a need to have. And some of the, to use some buzzwords, tectonic plate disruption that we've seen on the macros of like everyone having to stay home on the same week in March going forward for, still sort of, but, and like how much opportunity does that shakeup give us to rapidly adopt things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to kind of cease operations and go through that transition cost. And as we're seeing now, a lot of kind of, especially in big tech, are kind of seizing an opportunity right now to bring a lot of the things that people spend most of their time on, but maybe less of their ingenuity on, to these tools we've been building for like the last 5 years or so. And hopefully a lot of the kind of analysts in this space, in the HR space as well, are kind of indicating, hopefully, that a lot more value is going to be placed on kind of soft skills and people developing AI conversely, but less in the middle. That's kind of what we've been seeing through the research for the last few years anyway.
Excellent. And Isaac, any comments?
Yes, I agree with sort of the take Elizabeth has there, that, I think generally we're seeing this kind of adoption. I think some of the interesting trends I've been seeing is that it's not necessarily maybe just focused around AI for emerging technology. We're seeing this across the board for a variety of different things. And I think a lot of it has to do with the adoption windows are getting shorter and shorter. Mm-hmm. So as an example, Bank of America has implemented VR at all of their locations for training. So and they were the first ones to do it. Now, in terms of timelines, let's say 5-6 years ago, we're talking about the initial sort of boom explosion of VR. That's when you've got, the Oculus Kickstarters and stuff like that. So that's a fairly short adoption period from having a technology like there to a financial institution now trying to implement it. And I think we're seeing the same thing across other technologies too, like with blockchain, different models evolving, the interest applying to it. A lot of banks in the US have already started going in that direction. We're seeing regulators starting to pay attention to it. So it used to be that, things would always happen way later in terms of like the response from the more mature players. But just because the emerging technology is so immensely disruptive, I think I saw a study that said that, using AI on average gives you about 5 to 8% improvement against your peers who don't. So that's a bottom line average, some cases up to 20%. And so in a very competitive market, disruptive place, you're seeing more of an eagerness to, let's not wait for this. Let's not do things that we've always been doing it, because you see giants fall all the time. And you definitely don't want to be in that kind of a position. So I think there's an interesting balance between what we're seeing in terms of how quickly something pops up and it goes to that hype cycle of like, this is the greatest thing that we've ever seen. AI is going to change everything, to like in practice, what we actually see adopting it. What does it actually look like? What are the challenges that we face? How do we do this properly? Is this technology actually stable? Does it actually do what we think it should do? So I think there's a lot more, that sort of cycle is getting shorter and shorter. And so I think that's where you're seeing a lot of these organizations kind of have that view that, emergent technology isn't just something that we talk about around the water cooler, but something that, could be potentially a competitive advantage.
So you actually cover, it's interesting the way that you talk about that. It's very similar to the way that we talk to our customers around the value of emerging technology. So I think I'd love to understand, you referred to the idea of engaging executives in this conversation. So what are the core messages that you take to them? Because you have this amazing perspective from having worked in probably more nimble environments. And we all know that, the larger the company, the more difficult it is to effectively steer the ship. So when you're advocating and evangelizing the value of emerging technology in your firms, what are the core messages that you think resonate the most with the executives that you need to convince to take your point of view? That maybe you could start. That would be great.
Yeah, so our operating thesis with myself and my team has been really, it's difficult to get kind of meaningful, statistically significant insights from only a strategy of incremental building through kind of the H1 view of solving today's problems, H2 of starting to build out the roadmap for the things on the radar, and then not really having that much bandwidth or resources for the H3 of like the 3 to 10 years out stuff that's not currently even on any roadmaps. So the way we've positioned kind of the strategy with what we're doing with probably, some of the most risk-averse people, because they're good stewards, in one of the most risk-averse spaces in insurance and financial advisory, is kind of cordon off a canary in the coal mine team. So let us do the most radical things that we could, act as nimbly, act like startups, to build things, bring them out to market, demonstrate stuff, and then from that kind of like, okay, you're at A, we're gonna go check out Z, and from that we're gonna be able to plot kind of halfway between yours and halfway between ours what adoption can look like in a way that's actually gonna work. You're not gonna spend, $100 million on, a marketing gas or product market gas. And so we're doing that across VR, metaverse, Web3 projects, longevity and health span extension projects, InsurTech, of course. And it's been less than a year that we've been operating in this way, but it's been pretty exciting. Building kind of 3 to 5 startups in tandem towards these ends. Yeah, and we just started a zero knowledge proof decentralized data treatment platform for internal documentation treatment as well.
So Isaac, you have an interesting role, I think, because you also have to manage the risk of these adopting these technologies, but balancing that with, making sure that you're getting the business value and rapidly adjusting to the market. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your strategies on communicating with the key stakeholders in your organization on how to, balance rapid adoption so that you don't fall behind and you're not, one of the companies that's falling behind in that value curve. And also the idea that, hey, banks especially, and obviously insurers are your number one commodity is trust, right? So I think there's a pretty interesting balance there. So I think we'd all love to hear, like, what are the messages you talk about with the stakeholders in both regards?
So I've had a bit of experience in terms of talking about how to bring new technology across a variety of different industries, right? So even in something like starting off with like the space industry, I worked on the Cyrus-Rex project, asteroid sample retrieval. And one of the things that I worked in there was to create a new methodology, essentially to try to apply a new type of technology for a particular kind of technique that we used. The original one was developed back in the Apollo days, so we have sort of giants, masters of this place who created a technique, but times change, things get better. And within the space industry, we always have this joke that like here we are at the frontier with the oldest tech possible, because you actually need to have reliability and robustness to it, right? Like you don't want to spend 10 years and go somewhere with a technology that isn't guaranteed to work, right? So the risk has to be managed very effectively. But in that scenario, or even with tech companies that I worked with, the messaging is always the same, which is when it comes to actually presenting why you should do this, you should be very careful. First of all, don't fall for the hype, and don't use hype as a reason for advocating for technology. Something is hot, this is what you heard, etc. Because hype is a good way for you to lose the trust and your ability to actually advocate for it. The second one is, be very realistic about where the technology is. So, try to be focused on what is the value that you can deliver today, why this can actually bring more than you had before. So whether that's more certainty to your processes, in the case of what I did with that the NASA project, or even if I'm talking like with a tech company about, hey, we should try to use some AI to introduce some new functionality here. You're like, okay, all right, well, what's the value that this would give? What's the impact that it would have? My general experience with leadership has been that they care about making good decisions. So, when you come to present these particular technologies, make sure that you can actually deliver something to them that they can use as good information, and that you can also make them aware not only of the benefits, but the risks too. Because that's usually a piece that's kind of forgotten about in that conversation, because part of making a good decision is you have to know what's my value here, what's my risk. And a lot of times with emerging technology, that's very difficult to articulate. We don't know where the technology is going to be. Like 2008, Satoshi comes out. We've got Bitcoin. Here we are. Not that much longer. Where has this gone? Right. So it's very difficult for you to actually figure out where it will be. So when you're bringing those kind of technologies to the table, try to keep those things in mind. That's been my take on it. Is make sure to stay clear of any hype, understand what the real value is, and be able to articulate the risks so that if you present that, then they can be in a position to make those decisions. And that ultimately, I think from the emerging technology view is that just because there's a great new tech doesn't mean that it makes sense for the business, for the organization to onboard it at that time. So there is a right time. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And there's usually more that goes into that decision. So try not to force you to be a technology advantageous company. The organization needs to be making good decisions. If you can assist it, I think you'll have really great success with your emerging technology pitches.
Awesome. Yeah, and I thought you did a nice job of that actually right at the beginning around talking about some specific achievable metrics from an AI program as an example. You actually mentioned something that I think is maybe an add-on to this, is the idea of like having an incubator where you could do experimentation and things like that. I think one of the things we all would love to understand is, what do you think the biggest challenges are that you have to overcome to adopt AI at scale? Like, let's maybe shift into AI and the idea that it's an emerging technology. So maybe you could talk about that from the idea of, okay, we have an incubator, we're protected, we can experiment, but how do you take what you're developing there and then productize it, de-risk it, and what are the biggest challenges you see to taking those ideas and then actually putting them into production and driving value?
Yeah, so we're thinking about this in a few different ways and kind of experimenting on how to experiment to like broadly answer that. But there are a few phases of it, which are the rapid prototype of just 48 hours over the weekend, someone put together a working prototype using the super modern languages that developers and designers love to use, that large enterprises hate to use because they've just gotten everyone up to speed finally on the stuff from 5 years ago. But just to demonstrate the value of the UX, of if you can illustrate, this is what this can be, this is what people might like to use, might find value in. And then speaking to some of those, like, where's the actual value beyond the hype that might be good for technical retention or recruiting, of just like, okay, you get to use these cool things. But for bottom line stuff, like, is the human capital value add? Is the prospect qualify, close, retain, upsell? Like, where does it touch on any of those? If it does at all, where else can it contribute operationally? Just demonstrating this can be done. And so doing it without the constraints of, okay, we do need a Rosetta Stone in here at some point to be able to speak to the 1960s architecture that the data is currently being, stored in some places, and have it, be able to smoothly either ideally leapfrog, or if that's impossible, which it is in most cases at this scale, what's that bridge of dongles, I like to call that, painting that picture looks like. But it's not worth, scoping workflows and that roadmap and the implementation and the teams that need to be able to build it and the competencies that need to be built internally if you can't first demonstrate the value immediately just from having that UX available, having that tool to use. So once that's proven, then we meet with kind of the people really keeping kind of this massive operation going on and fighting the good fight to update that previous architecture, and then hopefully pinpointing places where there are leapfrog opportunities that they can kind of just cleanly shut off the old stuff, because we can start fresh and don't necessarily have to spend 5 to 15 years moving stuff over that might be rendered moot by the time we get there. So we think of it in kind of those two phases. Like, if this is proven, then we can scope out that either bridge of dongles or springboard to the 2.0.
Awesome. And I think we actually have an interesting dynamic here, because I would think that you two, if you were in the same firm, would be almost partners, right? Because you might be ready to operationalize, and then Isaac would partner with you. So what do you think about this, and how do you work with those incubation and innovation teams within, or what's your experience or advice for the team on both sides here?
So I think there's an old saying that I think captures the intent well, which is if you want to move fast, travel alone. If you want to go far, travel together. I think those kind of examples where we see a very small agile group, 2-3 people, can actually achieve something really impressive very quickly. But in terms of the longevity of what that achievement brings to the table, and all the challenges that are required in bringing, let's say, a very large organization to adopt it, is a very different, very interesting dynamic. So, let's say if we were to try to partner together, I think a big part of it would be to say, okay, you did something that's really cool, that's incredible. Where could this actually be feasible to implement now? Is there any place where, in a small way, we could maybe integrate it? Right, so you can think of sort of like in a baby step, gradual approach of okay, you've got something that kind of works. Let's hold our horses. We don't change the whole game just because of this one success. Let's think about proving out the idea. One of the things about emerging technology that's I think kind of a novel risk for it is that when we talk about integration, implementation, adoption, those time spans for a large organization can be very long. So it could maybe it easily could take 5 years if you've got a really fundamental technology you want to bring on board. 5 years in the emerging technology space is a lifetime. You could have companies come up, be worth $1 billion and disappear within 5 years. So you have to be sort of cognizant of that travel far scenario, which is if you've got this technology, okay, but what's the chance that this will actually stay in there? And do you make a plan that takes into consideration how long this might be relevant for? Because maybe you'll spend all this time and energy here now, but if you don't understand this landscape well enough, well, maybe a year or two from now, we're seeing the next evolution of this come through. Why don't we wait a little bit, see until this stabilizes a bit so we can pick a safer bet? Because otherwise, what you'll end up doing is you'll have all these great ideas, you'll put a lot of effort into it, and then as soon as you get this on board, someone comes up with a better thing, and then you're back to that place of I guess we got to keep going doing it again, and that kind of churn can definitely kind of create a lot of attrition. So it's about balancing those two views.
That makes complete sense, actually, and I think I'd be really interested in maybe pivoting the conversation now to your opinions on the current status of, say, the AI adoption curve in your industry, right? And I know it's difficult sometimes to speak to specifics, but you both, I think, have unique insights, industry wide and with big firms on where you're at in the adoption curve. So maybe we could have a little bit of a discussion on what your opinion is and how that compares to maybe some of the other industries or areas that you've seen. Does that sound fair?
Sounds fair. For the most part, I think similar to what I've been seeing with blockchain technology, the same's been true from what I've seen in terms of kind of the macro research we've been conducting, and then internally myself, is that a lot of it is sort of that duck in the water where the feet under the water is the enterprise infrastructural adoption, and then on top, it looks a little bit calmer in terms of the consumer-facing applications, apart from Dolly illustration and stuff that's kind of stolen the imagination recently. But a lot of it has been sort of more co-pilot than AI that stands alone to internal kind of like flagging tools of just like, hey, this might be something, not this is something, and therefore I could go execute on it. Just building up for the last, I don't want to keep saying 5 years, but like kind of, I think of that in like 5-year segments where a lot of the concerns from, L8s at Google to even startups has been focusing on solving just the kind of tagging problem of like, okay, let's organize the data and find ways to organize the data. And then we can get to kind of reliable insights and inferences. And really, the trust we're not, as far as I've seen, at a stage mature enough where the trust is there, where you're letting these things kind of run on autopilot, Tesla notwithstanding. And it's been more of like the co-pilot, the coach, the lookout kind of use case, and really for internal cybersecurity purposes to help clean up what people are manually going through. And then with Northwestern Mutual, some of the most recent for the last 2 years plus has been co-pilots for financial advisors to be able to pull up, okay, here are macro trends, but then you make your judgment, and the consumer needs to just be able to trust you and not have to deal with their own, Russian nuclear panel UX of, making their own, putting together a picture from this noisy data, and really just kind of helping to make suggestions, as far as I've seen it, kind of in broad strokes.
Isaac?
So, I think it's obvious just by virtue of this conference that AI is definitely a hot topic in finance. And I think almost every financial institution has some type of AI expertise or interest at play in terms of like an active component to it. I think it's also important to note that AI is sort of ubiquitous. It is permeating every industry, every group, every platform, every application use case, because part of the huge explosion of AI has been just the ease of being able to develop it. If you were talking about building traditional models back in the day, you need to have someone with a very strong mathematical and analytical background, someone with a very strong subject matter expertise. You got to bring them to the table and try to get it done. Whereas with AI today, you could get a 12-year-old who has no idea on what the financial system is to potentially build a successful financial model and deploy it. Got the data, train it, runs it out, does something like that. Without any sort of that context to it. So, I think that's kind of the proliferation that we're seeing across the industry as a whole, which is it's very easy to actually implement it, and there's lots of potential problems that we've never had the creativity to solve, that now we can just apply this to help us get to that stage. But also, I think, if we look at things like just Microsoft Outlook or Microsoft applications that we get, all of these things now have AI functionality being delivered to the enterprises. So this is I know it's a slightly different take on it, but the question of, what is the state of it? I think the state is that it's here to stay, and it's being delivered across every kind of tier of functionality for us. And then we're going to see, I think, more and more these kind of offerings being involved in here we are, we've just been working with Excel for so long, but at what point are we going to see NLP functionality built right into Excel? I've got my table in here, can I extract and do all these things from it? Click of a button, which will be sort of a new evolution for how we look at AI. This is no longer even something that you need to have a team on board to figure out how to use it, etc., but something where even just our traditional tools have been augmented. So I think the industry as a whole, I think, is kind of moving in that direction. But again, with emerging technology, we'll have to wait and see what actually materializes in the end.
Yeah, I suppose it'll be interesting if we take the the lessons we've learned from previous emergent technologies and frankly whether or not they're relevant, right? As AI becomes more pervasive in an organization. So I do want to make sure. I'm not sure if we have any questions for our guests at this point.